Hello and welcome to episode 10 of Revolutionary Ideas, the monthly Marxist podcast from Socialist Alternative. Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. These were the well-known words of Marx and Engels, famously contained in the end of the Communist Manifesto. This work, written in the 19th century, remains widely read but not always understood. Often misrepresented and distorted by the capitalist class and Stalinism alike, it is more important than ever that we ask, what did Marx and Engels really stand for? As we enter the stormy decade of the 2020s, with mass struggles on the horizon, rediscovering the real ideas of Marxism is needed to prepare us for events to come. In this episode, our regular panelists and hosts Tom and Yara will be interviewing Sebastian Kugler from the Austrian section of the International Socialist Alternative. Over to you three.
Hi everyone, welcome to this new episode of Revolutionary Ideas. This is episode 10. In this episode, we're going to be discussing the Communist Manifesto, that classic work explaining the fundamental positions of Marxism. This was a pamphlet written for a wide audience in the 1840s, published in the 1840s, at a time when the world, in many ways, was very different to how it is today. But as Socialist Alternative, as a socialist and a Marxist organisation, we would say that it carries a lot of very valuable lessons for us, And in spite of the short size of the pamphlet, it's actually incredibly rich with ideas that we should still consider to be relevant to us and our tasks as socialists today. So in this episode, we're going to be discussing with Sebastian Kugler, who is from our section of International Socialist Alternative in Austria, the Socialist Left Party. So first off, Sebastian, I guess I could ask a number of questions here and start this in many different ways. But really, I guess I could just start very simply and ask, first, what is the manifesto? What is the Communist Manifesto? Why is it important for us today?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on this podcast, and thanks for the opportunity to speak about the Communist Manifesto. I think every Marxist loves to talk about the Communist Manifesto and its relevance. The manifesto itself was a pamphlet, like you said, that was published in 1848, immediately before the French February insurrection, which basically kicked off the revolutionary year of 1848. It was quickly followed by the March Revolution here in my city, in Vienna. And all across Europe, revolutionary movements developed in this year. So it was really a revolutionary pamphlet for a revolutionary time. And so this alone kind of makes it very important for Marxists and the whole history of the labor movement. Additionally, it was from its inception on an internationalist pamphlet. It was translated into several different languages already weeks after it was first published. And it was basically the first real modern political program it was written by Marx and Engels for the Bund der Kommunisten, for the Communist League. Which was an international workers' organization, the first really of its kind, and which attempted to be a revolutionary international workers' organization. And it's also just impressive if you think that Marx was 29 when he wrote it, Engels was 27 at that time. I turned 29 Wednesday. And I can't really say that I have produced anything of this substance so far. So I think these are just some points on what the Communist Manifesto is and why it's interesting.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting. And I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit about kind of like, I guess, the main points that come through, because I think both you and Tom mentioned how this is a pamphlet. This is meant to be a program for a party. So as a kind of, what does this platform actually say? Because one of the first things it says in the manifesto is that everyone has been calling everyone communist, so it's time for us to put forward a plan. So what is actually that plan?
Right. Yeah, they talk about the specter that is haunting Europe, which they are now kind of like want to clear up what communism really is. And I think that's also a very important aspect of the Communist Manifesto, because it's the first real public declaration of scientific socialism. There were lots of different socialist trends during that time, lots of different ideas on what is wrong with capitalism, how society should look like. Should we go back to feudal societies? Should we model a perfect society? Should we strive to convince the rulers to be more generous, and so on and so on? So the importance of the Communist Manifesto was to really say, okay, this is scientific socialism. This is what we understand under communism, and it really developed the program of abolishing capitalism and freeing society from the bondages of class, out of the material conditions that this society has developed. So it's not just Marx and Engels who think we'd like society to be a bit more nice, or we think that society should look this way or that way, and that's why we now write this manifesto. It's more, and in that sense, a real application of the Marxist method. It shows the contradictions of existing society, and it shows their possible solutions. It shows that all hitherto existing society has been a society of class struggle, and that the solution to the contradictions in the capitalist society also lies within the class struggle of the proletariat against the bourgeois.
Yeah, I think that's a really good summary of how Marx and Engels actually open up the manifesto. I mean, there's that famous line that you were mentioning just then about the specter of communism haunting Europe, as he puts it, as they put it at the start of the manifesto. And I mean, that's a very famous saying now. It's very widely known that is what Marx and Engels say at the beginning of the manifesto, but it's not always widely understood what it is that they're actually talking about. So I think it can be useful to kind of go into that. What they're talking about is the prospect of the working class coming into existence, an industrial working class coming into existence, and because of its experience under the system, its experience under capitalism, drawing the idea that, actually we are exploited, but not only that, we can also run society. We have the power and the means to run society and to overthrow capitalism, essentially. That was something that terrified the ruling class in the way that someone would be terrified by a ghost. That's obviously what specter means, ghost. But we should take that back a notch as well, because they were writing this in a period essentially of revolution, or at least a period that was on the cusp of revolution. And they were also drawing these conclusions about how the working class can't find common ground fundamentally with the ruling class, with the bourgeoisie, and if it ever can, it will result in an act of betrayal somewhere down the line. And I think there's obviously something very valuable to take out of that. But there was another part in the manifesto which I read just the other day when I was kind of trying to refresh my memory a little bit about what it actually says. But it's talking about how society, as capitalism develops, polarizes more and more along class lines. These different layers of the proletariat by which he means the working class, and the bourgeoisie, by which he means the capitalist class, developing into separate poles, polarizing as the system, kind of like matures over time. And I think that, that's particularly important as we're in a period where we're often fed this idea that class is no longer important, that it's no longer a fundamental dividing line in society. But if you look at what's happening around us at the moment with the world under the COVID pandemic, a lot of people are doubting that. And many of those who aren't doubting it yet will begin to do so over the coming years, I think. And it's very useful to draw attention to these earlier socialists who were drawing these conclusions all the way back then about how like society operates now, but also what we can actually do about it and what section of society has the power to change that.
To me, that's actually the most fascinating aspect of the manifesto. It's not just how it captures the revolutionary era of 1848, but actually how advanced it is in anticipating the development of capitalism and the bourgeois society. I mean, they already show that the bourgeoisie has a reactionary role in society at a time when I think most people would say, well, in the 19th century, capitalism was still a progressive force, or it developed societies. It brought about like all these different progressive elements and so on. And already in 1848, they show how actually the bourgeois rule is already a brake on development of the productive forces. They show how the way the forces of production are developed by the bourgeois is a one-sided way, a very destructive way. Even before the Communist Manifesto, they use the term destructive forces instead of productive forces when they talk about like industry under capitalism. So it's absolutely fascinating how things that they wrote in the mid-19th century are way more like adequate now than they were in the 19th century. Just think about like the whole question of the working class in the times of Marx and Engels was in most countries actually a tiny minority, a tiny, quite homogeneous minority of factory workers and so on. I think the reason why many people today like might have the idea that there is no working class anymore is that the working class has grown so big that you can't see the forest for the trees. Basically, now almost everybody is in the working class, and that's why I think maybe some people don't see it. But if you apply Marx's and Engels' thought and their analysis of the working class, that these are people who have nothing to sell but their own labor, who work with tools that they don't own and who produce things that they don't own themselves. I think if you ask your friends what they do for a living, or if you ask your friends how their jobs look like, you won't find many artisans or peasants or something. You will find people who, I don't know, work as a cashier in a supermarket, who sell products that are obviously not their own, or who work on a production line, who build stuff that obviously they don't own, and obviously they don't own the machines, and so on. So really, the class analysis of the Communist Manifesto is today way more accurate even than it was in the 19th century.
Yeah, and I think it's a really important thing to say, because that distinction between classes, having the people that own the means of production or own what is producing, and the people who own nothing but their own bodies and their ability to create labor, is something that I think is very foreign to a lot of like young people now, because we always hear about the middle class. We always have these like 7 different classes that we hear about when we talk about class. And the 2007-2008 crash really showed that the difference is not how much you earn, it's about whether you have the actual means to produce more of that value. And I think that kind of leads me on to the next question. We talked a little bit about feudalism, about that period in the 19th century where there were bourgeois revolutions that tried to get rid of the remnants of feudalism in Europe. And I think one of the most interesting parts of the Communist Manifesto, I think, because everyone talking about communism, talking about Marxism, it's obviously that, like, it's obvious to everyone that Marxism is for the working class and against the bourgeoisie. But the Communist Manifesto actually makes the point the bourgeoisie progressed history. So I was wondering, how does that work? How do we hate the bourgeoisie but also say that they brought on change and brought on progress? So, like, what is this progress that's talked about in the Communist Manifesto?
Yeah, that's a very interesting thing. There's a great text by the Italian Marxist Antonio Labriola, who was kind of like the father of Italian Marxism, who writes about the Communist Manifesto that it's the greatest funeral oration, or the greatest eulogy that he ever read, because it praises the revolutionary role of the bourgeoisie, as well as declaring war on it. And I think the main thing the Communist Manifesto points out in this respect is that the revolutionary role of the bourgeoisie was mainly to unleash the forces of production to connect the whole planet into one world, really, and to really create the material conditions upon which a global classless society of abundance is even possible. That's something that never existed before the generalized production of abundance, which the bourgeois mode of production really brought about. And at the same time, like with all class societies, the rule of the bourgeoisie has become an obstacle to the development of these forces of production. And again, it's absolutely fascinating to think about that. Marx and Engels write this in 1848. At a time when capitalism in many ways was still in its infancy, and still they proclaim that it already is a break on the progress of society and humanity as a whole. They write that for many a decade past, the history of industry and commerce is but the history of the revolt of modern productive forces against modern conditions of production. So basically what they say is that already the capitalist mode of production is a break on the possibilities of development for society. And they talk mostly about the crises that capitalism brings up. But I think if we look at today's capitalism, this is, again, even so much more accurate. We see how the enormous forces of production, things that Marx and Engels couldn't dreamed of in their wildest fantasies, all of the things that are now possible and what they are being used for. We use drones not to make the life of people easier, but to kill each other. Think of the trillions of dollars that go into military research instead of cultivating land and environmental programs and so on. Just think of patents and how they slow down the vaccine rollout in the COVID pandemic. So again, it's absolutely mind-blowing how the productive forces are turned into destructive forces by the bourgeoisie.
I think those are some really good points there, and I think also it's funny how there's this part in the manifesto where Marx and Engels are essentially talking about how the bourgeoisie, while playing, a role of holding back the development of society by holding back the ability of people to truly kind of free themselves and holding people in a state of oppression and exploitation. But at the same time, he's talking about how the bourgeoisie historically played a somewhat kind of progressive role, at least in like the development of industry, the breaking up of feudal power and breaking up earlier modes of production like feudalism that came before capitalism, and how that represented what was a step in the development of history. It's sometimes kind of a bit of a vulgarization of Marx to say that he never gave capitalism credit for anything historically. But what Marx and Engels were doing was pinning down how, with the development of capitalist industry, what's being done is a basis is being laid for the eventual overthrow of the capitalist system. And I guess what I mean by that is like it's not for certain, and Marx never actually said that it's for certain that the working class will successfully overthrow capitalism and create a socialist plan of production. Because if he did believe that, if he thought that it was just an inevitability, he would never have bothered to get politically organised. He wouldn't have been bothered to organise the Communist League and write the Communist Manifesto. He wouldn't have bothered with, the likes of Engels and other socialists at the time to organise among the working class, to recruit workers, to organise them, and so on. So I think that's a very key point. But also, when we talk about capitalism laying the basis for its own destruction, look no further than the working class itself. We're often told by the kind of ideologists of capitalism, the ideologists of the bourgeoisie, that the working class is weaker now than it's ever been in history. But if you actually look at it objectively, the working class has increased in society. The working class has increased in size constantly and progressively throughout time, and that's something that we really need to get at. That there is a huge amount of potential power, latent power, that exists among the working class, both those organised in the trade unions and the different workers' organisations, but also those who are yet to be organised as well. That's the most fundamental part, the sections of the working class that haven't been organised and need to be. And this kind of ties into a point and a quote that they come out with, which is about how the bourgeoisie, by revolutionising society, by transforming society, creates its own gravediggers. And I think there's really something that can be drawn out there as well.
I completely agree. And but I would add that I think as Marxists, we should be careful not to think of the history of the bourgeoisie or the history of capitalism as this like linear line where you can say, well, it was progressive until the year, I don't know, this year or this day, and then it turned reactionary or something. Actually, Marx and Engels are very clear on this already in the manifesto, but even more so in later writings, that every progress the bourgeoisie has brought about was also an act of oppression and barbarism. Just think that the colonial expansion and like the world trade is the history of genocide, of slavery, and so on. The so-called primitive accumulation, the birth of the modern proletariat, the gravediggers of capitalism, was an incredibly violent process of expropriation and incarceration. Even like there were these workhouses and so on. The destruction of the house industry, like producing at home, laid the base for the modern oppression of women, and so on and so on. So I think it's not our job as Marxists to defend these atrocities in the name of progress. But on the other hand, keep in mind what the Marxist philosopher Walter Benjamin once said about class societies, that there has never been a document of culture which is not simultaneously one of barbarism. And I think only a socialist struggle, a social revolution that frees the world from capitalism can really bring about a progress that is progress for everyone and not just for a few on the backs of others.
Yeah, I think this is a really important point, and I think also I think it's really important to point out the fact that this progress isn't linear, and also we're talking a lot about these contradictions, and I think that it's really useful if you want to hear more about it. Our last episode, episode 9, actually talked about dialectical materialism, which I think really delves into the way that Marxists see progress in society and the way that Marxists see how society moves on, and exactly that point about how it's not linear, but it goes back and forth. But I think these contradictions are kind of key, and they keep returning in the Communist Manifesto and also in our everyday language as Marxists. We just talked about how this system produces so much, but not for what we actually need. And there's so much wealth that's created within the system and the progress in technology, but at the same time the working class is living in poverty, and this progress is not benefiting the working class itself. And of course how capitalism progresses itself but also creates its gravediggers. So I was wondering if you can tell us more about because I think that the manifesto focuses a lot on that theory behind it, but it's a call to action at the end of the day. So I was wondering, how does the Communist Manifesto explain how workers should fight or can fight against the exploitation within the system?
Yeah, definitely. The manifesto is a call to arms. It's not, a religious prophecy. It doesn't say, well, communism is going to come either way, and you better believe us, or something. It already mentions that class struggle also can have the result that both classes go down in ruin. And I think if we think about the impending climate catastrophe, that is something to keep in mind. The revolutionary socialists, in the wake of the Communist Manifesto, had this slogan, socialism or barbarism, which really echoed this sentiment of the Communist Manifesto. So there is, a huge part on, class struggle and how to organize class struggle in the manifesto. And I think one very interesting thing is that the manifesto gives a short overview over the hitherto history of proletarian struggle, which you can read as a historical development, but also as a logical one. So first they write about how individual workers fight their immediate conditions. Your workplace, on your workplace, you're furious about your living conditions. You want to smash something up. You might even blame the machine for taking your job and so on. Like the Luddites. Did I pronounce that correctly? I'm not sure. Which is historically even the first. And if you like genuine a worker struggle, but of course it's misguided. So then they say that these struggles kind of accumulate, become more unified, and become more and more they have the character of real class conflicts, and so trade unions are born out of these struggles as the more they are collectivized in a way. So, but in the end, and I think that's a very important point, Marx and Engels explain that every class struggle is a political struggle. So in the end, class struggle doesn't just mean fighting in your workplace or combining, trade unionist struggles, but it's a political struggle for power for the whole of society. And this means, like Marx and Engels say, the organization of the proletarians into a class and consequently into a political party. And I think that's the main lesson that the manifesto has for us today. It's the manifesto of the Communist Party. And we need a communist or a revolutionary workers' party in order to win the class war against the bourgeoisie.
Yeah, I think those are some really valuable points there. I think a slightly underrated part of the manifesto is where Marx is kind of outlining almost a bit of a blueprint of how he thinks that class consciousness can develop over time, how that develops into struggle and vice versa. It's a very interesting part about how the working class moves towards organisation. And he's essentially talking about how the collective experience of exploitation that the working class undergoes leads the working class towards further conclusions about how workers can demonstrate that we do have a sense of collective power, that we do actually have power when we stand together and we get organised. That's something that is going to be understood by a lot of people when they're taking strike action, for example, when workers through their unions are taking industrial action. And that was something that came out during much earlier periods of class struggle, particularly actually in England with the Chartist movement, the earlier movement for democratic rights. But also, I'm thinking about towards the end of the manifesto, where Marx and Engels are talking about the abolition of private property, because I think that's something that can very easily get twisted and misrepresented and misinterpreted a lot of the time, you know, particularly in how it could be represented as Marx and Engels saying that under socialism, nobody will have possessions, we can't have our own things, we can't have personal property, we can't have our own, you know, TVs or whatever. But Marx is clear in saying what he means by that, you know, that the ruling class will complain when Marx is talking about abolition of private property. But what he means by private property is the hoarded control that the capitalists have over society's wealth, over the factories, over the workplaces, over the places where wealth is produced. And that ownership exists to the detriment of the working class and to the working class's experiences and its conditions of life. So maybe, Sebastian, you could say a little bit to kind of expand on that, if you have any extra thoughts about what Marx means when he talks about private property.
Yeah, definitely. So when Marx and Engels talk about private property, they don't talk about your toothbrush, and they don't want to collectivize your toothbrush. Obviously, under communism, there will be toothbrushes for everyone. But they talk about, you know, the so-called means of production, the things that you need to create wealth, basically, to create all the things that we need, which are now in private hands, and in actually not that many private hands. What Marx and Engels say is that private property only exists because it doesn't exist for 9/10 of the population. And they even foreshadow the monopolization of capitalism, because they explain how, you know, capitalism already in the 19th century was on the road of destroying, you know, the small bourgeois property, you know, the small business owner with his 2 or 3 employees, and who is still, you know, who's not somewhere in a skyscraper or anything, but, you know, who works together with his employees and stuff like that. This, like the petty bourgeois, are being destroyed by capitalism, you know, by the innate trend of capitalism towards monopolization. And so basically capitalism undermines private property, even, you know, bourgeois private property, in the course of its development. And that's where Marx and Engels say that real, you know, real property, or the real wealth for all people, can only come through collectivizing the means of production, because the process of production, the labor, really is already like globalized and collectivized. Everything that, you know, we work with like comes from all over the world, and then is distributed all over the world. So we have already a global system, which then again is kind of like funneled through private hands, which is completely irrational. That's what Marx and Engels argue against.
Yeah, I think it's also a really important point when you talk about the way that this struggle is meant to go, because if the capitalist system is using its international powers to fight against the working class, then it means that the working class has to fight on an international basis to topple down the system. It's not enough for one country, or the working class in one country, to fight against the capitalist system in their own country. And I think that is something that's very, very clear in the Communist Manifesto. And I was wondering if you can very briefly, because we are kind of running out of time, I was wondering if you can tell us very briefly about what this struggle is going to look like according to the Communist Manifesto. How do we organize against the system? How did Marx and Engels say that in the 19th century? But also, what are the lessons for today?
Yeah, so what Marx and Engels say about the development of class struggle is that it has to be international. Like you said, the capitalist system is international, and and the proletariat is the class without fatherland, like they say in the manifesto. So they can't lose, this fatherland. Is the thing that the bourgeois always say. Well, you internationalists, you are anti-patriotic. You want to take the fatherland away of the people, and that's where Marx and Engels say, well, the proletariat has no such thing. And what they also say is that the struggle of the proletariat needs to be a political one. It needs to be an organized one, and that's why you need international workers' organizations. You need international revolutionary organizations. And the Communist League, which they wrote the Communist Manifesto for, was the predecessor of the later socialist and communist international organizations that followed. It was unfortunately destroyed by the bourgeois after the failure of the 1848 revolutions. It was banned basically in 1852. And dissolved under legal pressure. But Marx and Engels continued their fight. They co-founded the International Workers' Association, the first international in 1864, I think, which continued where the Communist League had to stop. And there's really a threat of international revolutionary socialists organizing in such organizations, and this threat leads up to the International Socialist Alternative, which we are all organized in. So.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming to take part in this discussion with us, Sebastian, and thanks everyone for coming. Thank you for listening, and see you next month.
Thanks for this incredibly useful and informative episode of Revolutionary Ideas. Make sure you join Socialist Alternative today. Go to socialistalternative.net to see regular updates on our work and for cutting-edge Marxist analysis. Go to our social media pages. On Facebook, we are Socialist Alternative ISA, England, Wales and Scotland. On Twitter, we are Socialist Alt EWS. On Instagram, we are socialistalternative.ews. And finally, on TikTok, we are socialist_vids. Thanks for listening and see you next month.